Hello everyone. Welcome to the second part of the video regarding the Russo-Ukrainian war and how it can end. Now, I'm talking here from the position of former Ukrainian. I guess I grew up in the Soviet Ukraine. I spent most of my youth up till I was 23-year-old in the Soviet Ukraine, and I did also spend a couple of years in Russia and Uzbekistan when I was younger. Traveled extensively throughout the Soviet Union. Sort of that kind of like lays out a bit my background, specifically about Russo-Ukrainian conflict. I wrote this thing, Ukraine Battlefield of Memories. So this goes into detail of the entire issue. Now, in the first part of my video, I was talking about the conflict between the Western powers and the Russian Federation. Now I'm going to be talking mostly about Ukraine and the Russian Federation in this context. So just to say that with my background, I left Ukraine in 1992 when I was already an independent state. However, I hardly lived in independent Ukraine, although I visited often since. And the last time I visited just 3 months before the outbreak of hostilities in 2022. And so what can I say about that? When I left Ukraine in 1992, there was no such a thing as Russo-Ukrainian problem. There was no Russo-Ukrainian problem. There was no Russo-Ukrainian conflict. And in fact, I would say that majority of Ukrainians at the time, probably let's say 3/4, were effectively Russo-Ukrainian. I would say more. I would say probably majority of the population of the southwestern Soviet Union was primarily, it was like I said, probably majority of its significant majority was composed of Russo-Ukrainians. So the conflict was really an impossible scenario in 1991, 1992. And there was no animosity as far as I can remember personally, and I can't recall anything sort of collectively. Now, having said that, let's just go back a little bit into the late years of the USSR. In the late years of USSR, the federal state was weakening rapidly under Gorbachev. Now, as Gorbachev was receiving very positive reaction in the West, in the East, it was a bit different story. That is at home, because the economic situation was deteriorating rapidly, and people were preoccupied with economics primarily, and because the new system was coming into place, which was this wild capitalism of 1990s. Not as much attention was paid to the national matter outside of the core of the inside of the core of the Soviet Union. I'm not speaking about the inside. I'm talking about Russian Federation, Belarus, and Ukraine. Now, on the outskirts of the Soviet Union, there were plenty of ethnic conflicts. They went from Caucasus to Central Asia to Moldova to the Baltics. So the Soviet Union was disintegrating along the lines of ethnicities in a lot of respects. And of course, as soon as the federal government signaled an acceptance for advancement of sort of this nationalist ideologies in all of these places, they kind of went ahead and started pieces start falling off in different times. And this is I don't see this process as particularly positive or negative. It just happened. Okay. Now, when it came to the core part of the Soviet Union, this is the core Slavic part, which again, I'm talking Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine. And when I speak about these parts, it don't necessarily mean ethnic Ukrainians, Russians, or Belarusians. In fact, the line is so blurry, ethnic line is so blurry, like it's frequently believed in the West that there's sort of this clear delineation between sort of Russian and Ukrainian and Belarusian. Let me disabuse of this notion. There's no such a thing. A lot of the culture in many respects, it sort of straddles all of those notions, including the language and everything else that comes with it. So there's no clear delineation of sort of nationality. Even like, for example, my background is mostly Jewish, but I don't consider it, but Jewish was only part of my identity. My primary identity was Russo-Ukrainian because my maternal tongue is Russian, but then I spent most of my life in the Soviet Ukraine. And of course, all sorts of cultural and food habits and all sorts of different customs and perceptions and how we sort of revolved around one another, how we related one another was very, I would say I wouldn't say cosmopolitan, but certainly very mixed. Okay. So that's how the Soviet Union was and how the later years were developing. Now, In 1990, as the Soviet Union was to start falling off the edges there a little bit, you know, when I'm talking about the ethnic strife, particularly, let's say, in Tajikistan or in Azerbaijan between Azeri and Armenians, um, there was an idea to preserve the core of the Soviet Union. It was a referendum that's proposed, and it was held in early 1990. And the referendum was, would you like to retain Soviet Union as a common state? And in Ukraine, that referendum received overwhelming majority support in 1990. So how in the world did the whole place fell apart just a year and a half later? Well, let me explain. As the federal state was weakening, and as Gorbachev's economic policies were not working, people were getting disillusioned. And of course, there was a lot of propaganda related to the fact that, look, if you become independent, maybe you a lot would improve. Now, the final sort of nail in this coffin was of course the attempted coup against Gorbachev in August 1991. In fact, on a personal note, I actually went to Moscow to observe the proceedings as it went on. But that's aside, that's a different story, I guess. And of course, in that coup, although Gorbachev was preserved and preserved his post as the president of the Soviet Union, effectively he was completely nullified by the figure of Yeltsin, who was towering politically in Russia at the time. And Yeltsin's agenda was clearly to separate the three parts. Yeltsin wanted to rule his own roost. So were the leaders of the Soviet republics in Belarus and Ukraine. So by the time the fall of 1991 rolled around, it was basically uh, the de facto state that the union was going to fall apart. There was no longer any discussion about sort of this common. Nobody was paying attention to Gorbachev any longer, and so the people were understood that everything had to be turned around and pivoted. And this is why this 180 happened in 1 year and a half. That's it. There was nothing to do with any particular change of mind, with anything significant respect in terms of economics or international relations or whatever. It was just simply a fact that was presented by the ruling classes to the people, and people had nothing else to do but to say, okay, we'll just do it this way. This is why when the December 1991 referendum in Ukraine delivered overwhelming yes for the Ukrainian independence. In fact, it was even in the southeastern Ukraine, where sort of this pro-Russian so-called sentiment is the most present, the vote was over 90% yes. The only region that was really on the threshold, and in fact, there was really nothing else to do, because Soviet Union was not even a question of whether you're going to stay in the Soviet Union. It was just a question: do you want to be independent, given that the Soviet Union is no longer going to exist? So people said yes. Now, even with that equation in mind, Crimea only in Crimea only 54% of votes said yes. In comparison, a stark comparison to the rest of Ukraine. Okay, this just tells you how Crimea was always a particular place relative to other regions. All right, so that's how independence came around. Then it was stamped in the Belaverska forest by the three leaders of the three republics, and Soviet Union disintegrated. Okay, so the borders were drawn, and borders were drawn exactly where the borders of the Soviet Ukraine, Belarus, and the Russian Federation were. In other words, there was no conflict. Okay, but at the same time, Ukraine, as a new state, had to find its new identity, because clearly, if you're a different state, if you drew a border with another state, you have to find your own separate identity. And as I mentioned, Ukraine at the time was the Russo-Ukrainian state, effectively. So how do you find this identity? Well, of course, the simplest way of doing it is finding it exactly where you are. That is, you're Russo-Ukrainian. You got to combine mythology, Russian mythology, Ukrainian mythology, World War II, the revolution, and so forth. Whatever you want to combine, it has to come in some sort of a easily digestible package. And in fact, that's actually the second president of Ukraine, Kuchma, actually attempted doing it when he wrote his book, The Ukraine is Not Russia. That's what he said. So, but that book was very mild. It was relatively mild take on the sort of on the idea how Ukrainians were different and from Russians, but it wasn't particularly antagonistic to Russians. Okay, but the issue was is that nobody wanted to give money to this enterprise because people were preoccupied with all their economic problems. Nobody was paying attention to the ideology of the state and to its mythology, right? The only people who were interested in doing it and giving money for it were the Western powers. Because as I mentioned, Zbigniew Brzezinski in his book, The Big Chessboard, effectively revealed that the West never relinquished Ukraine as a tool of anti-Russian pressure. Okay, now, so the money could have only come from the West. The money was only coming for that project, but that project did not really reflect the Ukrainian populace at the time, right? So so they began the process of changing of people's minds, and I have to say that the process has been very, very successful and very quick actually. So I'll give you an example. For by the time the Orange Revolution rolled around, a significant portion of the Ukrainian people already abandoned the sort of Russo-Ukrainian identity. Okay, even though there were still maybe majority of them speaking Russians and so forth, that didn't really matter. The idea is that the identity was already reformatted. And so, but the problem became apparent when all this Western money that came in order to support the creation of new Ukrainian identity, they went, instead of relying on this Russo-Ukrainian monolith, they went to the west of Ukraine, which has its own history, its own relationship with the sort of communist regime in Moscow, its own relationship with imperial projects in Europe and Russian Empire and so forth. And they went to that region, they took that ideology, and that's ideology of the minority at the time, and they adopted that as the main ideology of the state. Okay, this is why right from the beginning there was a lot of effort put in, and in fact that effort continued throughout the decades. The effort designed to outlaw, for example, Russian language. Okay, so of course in the beginning it was nothing really too severe. It was just say, well, we just have one state language, but that state language is not Russian, that's Ukrainian. Obviously the problem is, at the time when even that was announced, I mean, you have a situation where, let's say, 70% of Ukrainians have Russian as a maternal language. So that is obviously is designed to create a problem. That is not just a statement of sovereignty, that's a statement of problem creation, which was which was then further exploited by a whole bunch of different laws, a whole bunch of different politicians, like I said, throughout the Ukrainian history. This is nothing new. Of course, the most simple way to resolve the situation would have been to say, look, we're just binational state, we have both languages official. Not a problem. However, that was not done, and the cracks appeared already. And I'm talking just the 90s, right? So when I'm talking about Western ideology, Western Ukrainian ideology, let me explain a little bit. In the world now, the big, for example, the current Russian Federation, of course, one of the cornerstone of their state mythology is the World War II. Okay, now in 1991-92, Ukraine shared exactly the same mythology. Ukraine played a huge part on behalf of the Soviet Union, as part of the Soviet Union, in driving the Nazis back to Berlin. Okay, that was one of the cornerstone of history telling in Ukraine. And if you look at statistics, about 7.2 million Ukrainians fought in the World War II. 7 million fought in the Red Army, and only 200,000, roughly, let's say, fought in the different nationalist formations on behalf of Nazi Germany. Okay, so if you look at just sheer numbers of that particular foundation, you can see that the most plausible thing to say was to build on the myth of the Soviet victory over Nazi Germany. But that's not what happened. The Ukrainian state decided to bring people from the Western Ukrainian mythology into the national conversation and to make them heroes. The problem is, a lot of these people were not just sort of, people fighting for independence of Ukraine, some sort of philosophers, poets, or theoreticians. They were actual Nazis, and that was the problem. But they brought this into the state making, into myth making of the state, and that became sort of tearing apart the people. It became sort of not the cornerstone of the state, but it became the chisel that was constantly breaking the edifice of the state, because not everybody, it was guaranteed that many people were not going to agree to it, and it was going to be really regional sentiment, and yet they proceeded with this project. And I said that part of the symptoms was, of course, the Orange Revolution that took place. Orange Revolution was based on false assumptions that Yanukovych, the so-called, let's say, Russo-Ukrainian candidate, actually won the victory, but it was illegal because there were illegalities in vote counting and so on and so forth. Okay, so finally, as a result of Orange Revolution, Yanukovych lost to his rival who was advancing this other mythology. And then the next 5 years afterwards, that's exactly what Ukrainian state was doing, consistently advancing the idea that the heroes of the World War II on behalf of the Soviet Union, that the communists, anybody attached to the Soviet state, anybody attached to the Russian Empire, they were not part of the Ukrainian story. The part of the Ukrainian story came from Western Ukraine, where the people fought against the Soviets. But who were those people? Of course, that was very uh, subtle insertion into history, because they needed to whitewash the actual Nazis to make them heroes. And that process really never culminated in total victory. But what that process did, it destroyed the edifice of the Ukrainian state, destroyed the cohesion within the country itself. And of course, the language was continually used by it. I'll give you a personal example. Okay, so my one of my uncles was talking to one of my cousins, and the cousins was in Russia, and the uncle was in Ukraine. These people were from the same family. Okay, if they didn't like politics, well, they made him not like the communists. They made him not like the politics of the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire, whatever. The agreements like that, but there was never ethnic agreement between who they were, and in fact, they spoke the same language and everything else. And yet, out of the blue, one of them tells another, and that's I'm talking here right around the Orange Revolution, maybe slightly afterwards. And he tells the other that, you bloody Russians better get the hell out of Crimea. He was referring to the Russian fleet, right? And so that type of conversations begin to appear between the people who were really not that different at all whatsoever. The only difference was where you were located. Were you located in Russia or located in Ukraine? And this type of the conversations began taking place. So I'm a personal witness to this, and that's how they. But those conversations were not just taking place between residents and citizens of Ukraine and citizens of Russia who were their relatives. It was taking place at the kitchen table in Ukraine itself, and they were breaking up families. And the reason being because not everybody was willing to accept this new narrative, new storytelling. Okay, now when it came to and of course, but what happens, as I mentioned, this whole narrative didn't just come out of the blue. It was well financed by the West and the Ukrainian Western interests in the United States, Canada, Australia, and so forth. And the reason why they were so well financed and the reason why they're so well supported is because obviously the geopolitical big game is to find the platform, anti-Russian platform. And the other one is that majority of Ukrainian immigrants who formed this huge diasporas, particularly in Canada, the United States, and Australia, they originally came all from Western Ukraine. There were very few people who came from Eastern Ukraine. And the result, that narrative was very easy to sell to the moneyed interest in the West to advance money specifically for those who were producing these narratives. For example, you can find even today in Edmonton, you can find a statue of actual Ukrainian Nazi. Okay, but for the Ukrainian diaspora in Edmonton, it's not a problem because their original storytelling comes from that. And again, I'm not judging them. Okay, that's their story. That's their story. But one cannot interpret it as that fits for entire Ukraine. And this is why Maidan took place in 2014. And this is why the events that followed Maidan followed in the way they did, because Ukraine was not a monolithic state. And like I said, I already mentioned in the previous video, when it comes to Crimea, it was a completely, entirely different level playing field. Because in Crimea, even at the beginning of Ukrainian independence, people were not particularly interested in independence. And the reason being because the idea of adherence to the Ukrainian state in Kiev and Crimea was always the weakest. Crimea, even at one time, actually had autonomous status. This is why things played out in Crimea the way they played out. That's why Russians took over Crimea essentially without a shot, and people actually, vast majority of people voted to adhere to the Russian Federation. Again, this is not to say it was illegal for the Russian Federation to seize Crimea, but this is where it comes from. Now, when it comes to other areas in Ukraine, that's a little bit different. It's a little bit more diluted. It's a little harder to say. But in general, one could definitely say that southeastern Ukraine was always much more favorable to sort of the Russian narrative than, let's say, Western Ukraine and Central Ukraine. Okay, and that's why that whole war was effectively sold to Ukrainians at that time as the war against the separatists, the terrorists. It was called, the operation was called anti-terrorist organization, because the government that was taken over by the elements who were pursuing the Western Ukrainian ideology, that's the language they talked to. Anybody who disagreed with them, even though they were Ukrainians, they were condemned. Okay, and that's how that war persisted. That's why the agreements were torn apart. That's why the Minsk One was not fulfilled. Minsk Two was not followed. Right, but internally, inside of themselves, Ukrainians still felt that that was the only way to settle the situation effectively. This is why in 2019, when Zelensky was elected, he was elected as a peace president with 73% approval rating. Okay, and why was it possible? Simply because everybody understood. Like I said, this narrative in Ukraine is very difficult to advance, and the reason being because those people who advance sort of the main narrative from the West, they not just have the control of the narrative, but they also have control of the armed forces. I mean, when I say police, enforcement, right? So in the Ukraine post 2014, it became very difficult to advance an idea. In fact, parties were outlawed and everything. Like the party was originally part of the alliance that brought Yanukovych to power, who was actually a target of the Maidan, right? Now, just going back to a little bit to Maidan, this is interesting statistic. I'll tell you, like people don't know it. There was this massacre at Maidan. Now, the massacre was, but according to all evidence that I've seen, obviously the massacre was staged by the rebels, by the opposition who were fighting the sitting president Yanukovych, who himself was a bandit. He was a complete crook, but he just happened to be the representative of the Russo-Ukrainian interests. Okay, power. That's just what happened. Anyway, so opposition staged initiated this massacre. In the course of this massacre, now the massacre was undertaken in order to go the police and to start shooting at the demonstrators, and demonstrators shooting at the police. So what they started doing at the very outset of this operation, they started shooting in both. Okay. As a result, about 100 people died. Okay, 77 of them were members of the opposition, the rebels. Okay, out of those 77 people, I believe, not to be, let's say 25 of them were from Kiev, from local people, right? 50 plus, 90% of them were from Western Ukraine. Okay, this is who was actually fighting and shooting in Maidan. Okay, now when it came to the other side, there was a 25 policemen died or something like that. All of them were from southeastern Ukraine. Okay, so even in that microcosm of that incident, of that massacre, you can actually see that there's two sides of the same thing fighting. Okay, and of course, but here's the thing: in the Western narrative, there's a lot of statements such as the Ukrainian people are innocent, and I completely agree with that statement. Ukrainian people are innocent, but this is nothing to say about the Ukrainian state or the Ukrainian politicians, because the Ukrainian state and Ukrainian politicians knew exactly where the money and support was coming from and what it was for. And they knowingly advanced this agenda throughout different administrations. I'm not just talking about whether it was Yanukovych, whether it was Yushchenko, whether it was Poroshenko, okay? All of them understood exactly where the wind was blowing, okay? And all of them, in one way or another, now Yanukovych in much lesser form, and obviously because Yanukovych, again, was the representative of this sort of original Russo-Ukrainian monolith that proved really not a monolith, but just a broken pottery. Okay, but the other ones like Yushchenko, Poroshenko, I mean, they were advancing this idea outright, and all Ukrainian parties, so almost all of them, maybe with the exception of the party of Yanukovych, I mean, they all look to the West as their saviors. This is an old joke in the Russian language, in Russian Ukrainian language, I guess. The West will help us, right? And so that's what they were actually bringing to life. The whole idea of West will help us was brought to life. The whole idea was, well, we're gonna live a fantastic life. They, as if they never learned from the 90s, when the prescriptions that came from the West about the economic development was a complete disaster, right? Well, they thought 20 years later the West is going to do the right thing. Of course, it's a mistake. The West is not interested in any such thing. But that's how they were bought effectively. And so they advance this ideology because the West, you have to advance this purely Ukrainian ideology and move it in such a way as to completely destroy this remaining Russo-Ukrainian shards from the table. Okay, and there is a result. Of course, you have to sign up with our project. And 2008 Bucharest announcement of the NATO candidacy for Ukraine was one of those steps. And all Ukrainian politicians took part. Well, not all, but like I said, majority of them took part without really, as if not understanding at all what this could lead to. Okay, so you have the 2008, you have the Georgian War, which didn't end very well, particularly for Georgia, who started it. Then you have the sort of the Russian reset with the Americans, which didn't work. Then you have the Maidan, and then you have the the massacre, and then you have the coup, which I discussed in the previous video, right? And then you have a war, and of course they're saying this is anti-terrorist organization. That's a new legal government in Kiev saying, but in reality it was a civil war, okay? And they started it. They didn't have to do it. Like, Russia had an option not to seize Crimea. That was illegal. It was criminal. They seized it. So did the Ukrainian state had an option not to start a civil war, but they did. Okay, and that's how we rolled in 2019 as Zelensky as a peace candidate, overwhelmingly winning the elections. Despite what you might hear from sort of Ukrainian propaganda or opinions of some Ukrainian politicians or commentators or whatever, Zelensky won with the exact presumption that he was going to fulfill Minsk II. He didn't win as a peace candidate to wage war. He didn't win as a peace candidate to bring NATO in. He won as a peace candidate to fulfill Minsk II. And everybody knew that. But what did Zelensky do? Now, I can't necessarily blame it on him entirely, because obviously, as I mentioned, all power structures by then in Ukraine were controlled by this other sort of nationalist Ukrainian narrative. Okay? And these structures are very powerful and very ruthless. And I have no doubt that Zelensky was actually covered and completely reneging on his original election position. In fact, we actually have video when Zelensky went to the trenches of the nationalists who were fighting in the Eastern Front against Donetsk, and he was trying to sort of talk reason to them, somehow persuade them that somehow, maybe we should just fulfill Minsk II, and he was literally told to go to hell. Okay, so I understand the pressures, but he took the chance, and now he's doing it. Okay, and of course it didn't work out. And he, to say that Zelensky didn't understand what was going on, everybody understood there was a risk. Now, not many people expected that Russia was going to do what Russia did, that is illegally invade entire Ukraine. Okay, but the risk was there, and Ukrainian political classes just played along. They were not interested in any modulation. They were driving forth. The last time I was visiting my hometown in 2021, like I said, 3 months before the war, I was amazed that on the street you heard almost exclusively Russian still after all these years. But I went to a cafe, and then the clerks were talking to each other in Russian, but they turned to me and they say in Ukrainian, and I kind of laughed. I mean, I don't mind. I mean, to me, binational state, bilingual state is a fantastic idea. I think it's great when one person chooses one language, the other language. They talk in both languages. They don't need a translator. I mean, it's beautiful, honestly. But that's not what's happening. They have a law whereby which in all official sort of places of business, only Ukrainian had to be used. So you have this completely absurd, sort of laughable situation where everybody around speaks Russian, including the clerks. But then when I have to interact with the clerks, they have to use Ukrainian. I mean, just nonsense. But that's exactly what's been done to the Ukrainian people by their political classes. Okay, and then you have the war of 2022. Okay, and now what do you have? You have obviously, on the one side, imagine an average Russo-Ukrainian who still lives in Ukraine. Okay, on the one side, you have this constant pressure of this nationalist narrative. And by the way, this constant pressure of nationalist narrative has gone to complete absurd distances. I'll give you an example. In 1941, there was a very important, significant, barbarous massacre of Jews in Kiev. It's called Babi Yar. I don't remember exact numbers. Let's say 30, 40,000 people died in the span of a few days. Okay? A majority of executioners were Ukrainian nationalists. I mean, the Germans, of course, oversaw the operation and everything else, but majority of people who actually did the dirty work were the Ukrainian nationalists who were killing the Jews. Guess what? Today in Kiev, the major artery, the major street that leads to the memorial of Babi Yar is called after Stepan Bandera, which is the Nazi Ukrainian nationalist of the world of time of the World War II. Okay, how is this possible? What state, even if you're trying to bring two narratives together, how is this possible that you literally spit in the face of another by doing this? Okay, at the very least, couldn't you just move the street somewhere else? No, actual street named after Stepan Bandera goes right to the memorial for Babi Yar. Okay, this is how crazy this gets. So we have to 2022, what the average Ukrainian citizen who can actually be the cornerstone of this new state feels. On the one hand, he has this complete, it's a drumbeat of nationalist ideology on the one hand, right? On the other hand, you have Putin bombing them, destroying their houses, killing their friends, right? You're between the rock and the hard place, okay? So you have to either subscribe to nationalist ideology or you have to just shut up and bear, okay? So this is that's where Ukrainian people are today, unfortunately. No, I'm not saying they should have done better or whatever. I mean, people are always subject to the politicians. And whenever people say, oh, they elected politicians, it's not exactly true. As we know in our developed democracies, I live in Canada, United States, to say that somehow elections actually play a role in what people think, I think it's a big overstatement, okay? So same with Ukrainians, right? And so what do we have now? We have a fractured Ukrainian state of people who are either completely sort of silent on the new on what is going to look like, or the people who's completely taken over the nationalist ideology, and that's what we have. And then we have Russia bombing them on the other hand, and so Ukraine is a weak actor in this, right? Ukraine has as Trump, as much as I'm not a big fan of Donald Trump, when he told Zelensky in the White House, I think it's February 2025, when he said you have no cards, I mean, he's right. Ukraine has become a complete proxy of the West. Ukraine is a weak country, broken country, right? That is stuffed by the West, by latest killing technology, by latest weapons, in order to bleed the Russians at the expense of Ukrainians. And that's been said openly. There's absolutely no they're not even hiding it. I mean, they're literally open, calling it the proxy war, as Boris Johnson said, as Lindsey Graham, as late John McCain, as a whole bunch of other European and American leaders. It's a proxy war that they're advancing at the expense of Ukrainians. To the West, it doesn't cost very much. It just costs money, but the West can print money. And it's actually great for their military industrial complex. They can test new technologies and so forth. So you have the main conflict between sort of the current imperial power and the former imperial power of Russia that is fought at the expense of Ukrainians, right? And what do we have? What are the possible outcomes of this conflict? Well, we either fight to the complete exhaustion of one of the parties. Now, considering that Ukraine is smaller than Russia, has many, and of course smaller than Russia, particularly in human resources. That's the main thing, right? Because of course they can always receive new weapons, but resources they don't have. And so most likely Ukraine is going to be completely exhausted. The man is not going to be even present anymore in Ukraine, right? And then what's going to happen? And then either West will have to escalate and bring their own soldiers and troops, which will effectively become World War III, okay? Or we have Russia taking over the rest of Ukraine. Either way, it doesn't look good for Ukraine. So this is an important moment for Ukrainians to recognize that this is what's done to them by both of these actors. And this is a time for them to stand up for themselves. I'm not saying they should have a revolution, okay? but I'm just notionally saying they have to stand up for themselves. Because uh, let me formulate the thought. Because if they don't, that's exactly what's going to happen. They're going to be exhausted, and it's either Russia is going to take them over and completely sort of probably incur, decade-long sort of insurgency war or whatever, or they're going to start a World War III, because once Ukraine is exhausted, they will have to bring Western troops. Ukrainians have to recognize they have an agency in this, and their agency to say stop it. And they almost did. They had Istanbul Accords. Istanbul Accords, when the Russia came, first when they invaded Ukraine in February 2022, a month later, they had an accord. Accord that almost appeared to have satisfied Ukrainian elites. But why cannot replay that accord today? Of course they can. And I tell you this, majority of Ukrainians know that's how it's going to play. How it's supposed to play, rather. Not how it's going to, but that's how this war can be ended. Through exact same type of accord. The only difference is where their territorial gains are. So if the accord in Istanbul 1 was about Lugansk and Donetsk, now they're talking about 2 more regions. But at the end of the day, this is about the same accord. No NATO, those 2 regions, 3 regions, 4 regions, and that's it. That could have ended in Istanbul. It should end in Istanbul too. Okay? And majority of Ukrainians understand that. I'll tell you how. The first few months of the war, particularly the first year, but particularly the first month, Ukrainian military had no problem recruiting people. A lot of people went to fight. If people came from abroad, they went to fight. They had no problem at all. But throughout the war, as the war progressed, they got exhausted. And now, almost all new soldiers supplied to the Ukrainian army are through forced mobilization in Ukraine. Forced mobilization to the point where young men don't even go on the street, or don't even take public transit, or don't even go to work. Or if they go to work, they get paid illegally, so nobody can track them, they're working there. And the reason being, because majority of young men in Ukraine don't want to fight. What is it indication of? It's indication they don't see the purpose in fighting. And the reason why they see no purpose in fighting is because they innately reject this Western Ukrainian ideology of a complete victory over Russia. In other words, this whole idea of not wanting to fight, it kind of underscores what the will of majority of Ukrainian people, but it's the will that cannot be publicly expressed. And this is the difficult point. But this is what needs to happen, because only through expression of this will can this stupidity can be stopped, in my opinion. Okay, now I'll give you one last anecdote and sign off. So the anecdote has to do with if you remember, like, because you could be saying that you could, have a listen to me. You could say, well, he's Putinist or something. He supports Putin, Russia, whatever. He, obviously is trying to send this message for Ukraine to surrender and so on and so forth. But and all his stories about the Ukrainian Nazis, he's making them up. And of course, that sounds like I'm really supporting this whole idea of Putin saying he wants to denazify Ukraine. Now, I don't support that goal, number one. Number two, it's partially true and partially false. Because Putin, when he says he wants to denazify Ukraine, he wants to denazify all Ukraine, right? That completely crazy, because, of course, majority of Ukrainians are not Nazis. Okay? But there's partially true, because, as I said, this ideology based on the Nazi heroes of World War II has taken a stronghold, particularly in enforcement apparatus in the army just recently. And about Nazi Andrei Beletsky was named the Brigadier General of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. And this is the guy who literally on the record of praising Adolf Hitler, of advancing white supremacist ideologies, of using all sorts of Nazi symbolism. I mean, it's crazy. And he's made a Brigadier General of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. I mean, it's there. It's in your face. Now, I'll give you the last story just to understand, kind of give it a bit of flavor here. As you recall, a couple of years ago, there was a scandal in the Ukrainian parliament when Zelensky was visiting Canada, and our great former Minister of Foreign Affairs, Chrystia Freeland, was in charge of that visit. They brought a former Nazi into Canadian Parliament, and the whole Parliament applauded him. Now, of course, they blamed it on the speaker. They said, "Oh, the speaker, he's a piece of shit. He didn't understand that this guy was a Nazi." Okay, what a moron! No, 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 no. There was no mistake, and speaker had nothing to do with it. Speaker simply rubber stamps proceedings into the Parliament. Okay, the man was brought by Zelensky and Hristia Krylin, and they knew exactly who the man was. The only problem with Zelensky, he might have not understood the Canadian sensibilities. He might have not understood that in Canada still, despite the strong presence of the Ukrainian diaspora, which is like I said, feeds on the Western Ukrainian narrative, it's still a taboo to bring Nazis into the parliament. So Zelensky may have made a mistake. But Hristia Freeland, she's a completely cynical operative who's utterly revolting and disgusting individual. Her grandfather was actual editor of a Nazi newspaper during World War II in Krakow. Now, my grandfather could have been Lavrenti Beria, okay? So Joseph Stalin, okay? Of course, the sins of your grandfather does not make you a sinner or doesn't make you a bad person. The issue is that if had my grandfather was Lavrenti Beria, I would have said, well, he was a crook. He probably was a bad man. He probably was a murderer, okay? Now, when Hristia Freeland is asked about her grandfather, she says that he was a freedom fighter. And he was a wild Nazi, but she says he was a freedom fighter. Now, this freedom fighter, of course, came to Canada. And that's, again, that's just an example how in Canada, many of these freedom fighters ended up after the World War II. So she completely cynically exploits his very murky past, refuses to admit that he was a Nazi. She clearly carries on this mantle. She knows absolutely story from 0 to 100. And yet she chose to bring this guy into the parliament. That is an interesting story. I don't understand the Canadian, to be honest with you, Canadian establishment never dealt it to the very end with this story. They kind of blamed it on the speaker and shoved it under the table. And instead, they should have pursued the connection with Hristia Freeland, who was in charge of the visit. But instead of sort of castigate Hristia Freeland and censure her, right? She now has been made this ambassador to Ukraine, in charge of Ukraine reconstruction. Imagine how much money could be laundered through that operation. Anyway, this is my last. All right. So what we have in conclusion? In conclusion, we have this fight between the current empire and the former empire, where the current empire have been pressuring and poking the former empire into reaction. Finally, reaction happened. Both actions are immoral and illegal. But what's happening to the subject of the quarrel here? And the subject of the quarrel, I'm talking about Ukrainian political establishment. Of course, the price that's been paid, obviously paid by the Ukrainian people, but the political establishment of Ukraine has led them to this point, and it has to be emphasized. About 10 years ago, I happened to be privy to a meeting between Ukrainian politicians and one of the sort of Secret Service assets. And Secret Service asset, I mean, I'm talking about U.S. Secret Service, right? He declared that America wanted to wash Putin's hands in blood of Ukrainians and Tatars. I think at that time they were trying to undertake an operation in Tatarstan as well. And that cynical and completely open admission of using Ukrainians for the purposes of the United States foreign policy was appalling. What was more appalling that the Ukrainian delegates didn't seem to blink an eye. That was just like a normal thing. Yes, please use us. Okay. Now that's one aspect of the equation, but to bring it to bear, to bring it to the desired effect, Ukrainian establishment not only trodden on their own history, rewritten their own history, and allowed themselves to be used, they brought the worst elements of their past history into the realm of hagiography, where they made heroes out of people who should have been despised and forgotten and used as lessons what not to do in history. They've been brought to the status of heroes in the modern Ukraine. And all of this is very sad, but at the end of the day, this is up to Ukrainian political classes to realize where they have led Ukrainian people, and they have to revise their position. Without that, as I said, there's only two options. Either this project escalates in the World War III, or it's going to lead to the complete depletion of Ukraine, of its manpower, of its future, and it's going to be left just as a bare body for foreign interests to explore. I mean, this is where the deal with Trump comes into play with this foreign with the resource deal and so forth. So that's how I see the situation. The only reasonable way to resolve the situation is through an accord like Istanbul 1. Yes, I understand Istanbul 2 might not be as favorable as Istanbul 1, but that's just the way to do it. And the way to go into the future is that Ukrainian establishment has to come back to their Russo-Ukrainian roots, to place Ukraine and their people and the tradition and the culture in their proper geographic and historical uh, his historical position. Without that, the incessant conflicts with Russian Federation will continue, and nobody wants that. I mean, enough for the last 3.5 years, the amount of death and destruction that's been visited upon Ukraine is more than enough to pay for this interest, to pay for these policies. Okay, so this is just my final word on this particular subject for the moment. Thank you very much for watching. Hopefully, you enjoyed the video. Cheers.